Hello! In this video, we're going to be talking about reading models. I know, it's not really an exciting topic, but it's important for you to know where different strategies and teaching techniques that you are using or are being suggested to you come from. And so, hopefully, this will let you look at the teaching techniques and strategies that you're using right now and see where they're coming from and whether or not they're consistent with what you believe about literacy, how it's learned, and how it's taught. Just because something has worked in the past doesn't mean that it's right for you. And so what we're going to do is quickly look at some of the reading models that we've used over the years so that you'll be able to quickly recognize, is this consistent with my personal beliefs about literacy instruction and literacy learning? And so we're going to just quickly look at these models and hopefully it'll help you. And so the first model we're going to look at is the oldest. It's a hierarchical model. This has been around since the Greeks. And it's this idea that what you have to do is to learn the names of the letters of the alphabet and learn their sounds first before you can do anything with reading. You know, intuitively as an adult, this sort of makes sense. We like to break things down into small chunks and to make them manageable when we're working on a large complex project. But I want you to take a second and think about the children that you work with. Is that the way that children work? It's not like any children that I've worked with. Children deal with things in complex ways. And so we've moved past this model, but you can see how intuitively it works. But a lot of it has creeped into our literacy instruction. We have this idea that when children come to kindergarten, we need to assess whether or not they have the letters of the alphabet. In the same way, we use that as a metric as to whether or not we've done a great job at teaching. And so we tend to take these things and teach them in isolation. And intuitively, as adults, we think this might work, but it actually makes it harder for children. But the way that this model works is that you have to learn the letters first. And then once you have a bunch of letters, then you can put those letters together in small words. So, for example, you can put these letters into word families. This is where we get that idea of using word families. It's not that word families are bad, but teaching them in isolation without meaningful context doesn't help children learn. And so we put these into small word families, and then you put those small word families or small words that you've learned together. And so the idea though is that you need to learn each one of these sections first before you can access meaning, and everything is isolated from each other. So we do the alphabet in isolation, we do the word families in isolation, and then once we have both of those things, then we can create meaning. The next model that we use is the skills reading model. And so we use this model up until about the 60s. This is a great advance over the hierarchical model. It's the idea that, you know what, you can learn some of the letters, like I described in my cat example, and you can learn some words and then put those words together and then create meaning. And so we're sort of teaching, we're still teaching in isolation, but we're combining them a lot sooner and using them together. This is the basis of our understanding of most basal readers, this idea of a restricted vocabulary. So children need to know the words before they can make meaning. Once again, intuitively, this makes sense, but it doesn't jibe with the experience that I've had with children. And so this model doesn't ring true for how children learn to read and write, and how children use literacy. And so we moved past this idea. It's an old idea, especially here in Canada. We've moved on to a socio-psycholinguistic reading model. It's this idea that you're using cueing systems and that reading is a process. The other reading models, if you look at them closely, only touch the surface of how reading works. This reading model, first given to us by Ken Goodman in the late 60s, looks at reading as a process and understand how children learn and use literacy. And so if we look at it, at the core, we have semantics or meaning making. So, and then you have syntax, or many of us would think of those as the rules of language. And so if we're working with young children, like kindergarten children, you know, knowing that a book has a cover, has a front page and a back page, and that we read left to right, those are all rules about literacy that children have to learn. And older grades, we're looking at genres and how the genre functions all together. We're looking at grammar. Those are rules of how language works. The next is graphophonics. So the way that the words look and the way that the words sound. And so we do those both together. And these are essential to children's use and understanding of literacies. The last one is pragmatics. And it is the context for the literacy that the child is working with. And so the idea that I like to think about is a mystery novel. So mystery novelists are fantastic at this. They use what they expect and your anticipation of what's happening, and then they twist it. It's the same as one of my favorite authors, Charles Dickens, does this in all his stories. You know, you look at the first 2/3 of most of the stories that he writes. He tells you about the characters, he tells you about the setting, and then in the last third, he changes them. He's building on the fact that you have expectations for what is included in a novel, and then manipulating you. And the really important thing here is that if you look at it, you need all 4 cueing systems. In some places, they don't have pragmatics. They don't talk about pragmatics as a separate cueing system, but as the milieu that literacy exists in, and I'm fine with that. That's Ken Goodman's original model. This model is put forward by Jerry Harste and Carolyn Burke. But regardless, the point is that you need to have all 3 or 4 cueing systems working together to create an instance of language or an instance of literacy. And so this idea that we can teach letters in isolation, and then once you have enough, then you get to meaning, when you look at this model and how literacy works, you see that it actually makes it harder for children to learn how to read like that. They need to have meaningful context. And so we need to teach literacy in a way that allows children to use all of these cueing systems. So for example, there's nothing wrong with using word families if you do so in a meaningful context. You, of course, are going to be using phonics, but we don't teach kids, we teach children rhymes and onset, and we make it playful within a book or within a song. We can play with sounds within a meaningful context. It's the same with this idea of teaching grammar in isolation. I mean, I remember that from high school, and I remember being bored to death. But anytime I've been editing a paper that I've written, or a poem that I've written, or something that's really important to me, and my editor or a friend talks to me about, tense use or issues with my grammar, two things happen. Number one is I'm interested and excited to learn that. And the second thing is that I remember it, and then I apply it to all my future writing. And so because I'm working from within a meaningful context. And so that is the change that we have done in literacy instruction. And that is what we do here in Ontario and here in Canada. And that's the way in which we can help children learn best. When we look at this next model, it's a different way of representing the same thing. But Ken went on to talk about how the reading process works. And so we use meaning, syntax, graphophonics together to predict what's coming next as we're reading. Our brains are these incredible meaning-making machines. And so we're constantly predicting what's going to come next when we're engaging with the literacy, or quite frankly, when we're engaging in the world. And then our brains also are then sampling to make sure that that prediction is correct. And then the final thing that our brains do is that we confirm whether or not that is correct. And if it's confirmed, then we keep going. If it's rejected, as it doesn't make sense, or it seems weird, not consistent with everything else that we've been reading, then we stop and we go back and see where things have gone wrong. And that is how the reading process works, and that's how we understand it now. And today, we are working, literacy researchers in Canada and throughout the world are working on expanding our understanding of literacy. And so now we think of literacy as literacies, and we're exploring new literacies and digital literacies and what literacy means. And we're developing new models. But these models here that I'm showing you are historical ones that we've used, and the ones that we're currently using in schools. And so these will be something that's useful, hopefully for you, to look at your own practice and to see, is your teaching practice supporting literacy as a meaning-making process that supports children's use of cueing systems? Or is it making literacy learning and use harder for children? I'm not saying that this is on purpose, but it's something that happens. And we often use practices in our classrooms that make sense for us as adults, but aren't useful for children. So anyhow, hopefully you find this video useful. And it's something that will help you in your teaching practice. Thank you.